specific fiscal guideposts. Maintaining the 2023-24 deficit at or below $40.1 billion.
Exceeding that target put the total federal debt at just over $1.2 trillion, which the government has argued isn't bad.
Canada maintains both the lowest deficit and the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the G7.
And she's not wrong, except she's kind of wrong. I'll explain why. So let's try to understand the argument we've heard from the Liberal government quite often that maybe isn't wrong so much as it is misleading. And they made this argument again in their fiscal update this week, that careful and responsible fiscal management has put Canada in an enviable fiscal position relative to our global peers. As in, we're doing pretty well compared to Japan, the UK, the US. And how do they arrive at that conclusion? Well, they mention debt to GDP ratio 23 times in the same document. So let's venture a guess that has something to do with it. And it turns out, yes, this is the key. The federal debt to GDP ratio in 2023-24, the most important metric, is 42.1%. What they're arguing here is that as a proportion of what Canada makes in a year, GDP is like its income, right? Canada's debt is less than half what it makes annually. When they point out no other G7 country can top Canada's ratio, it's just misleading because, first, they're only counting federal debt. It's important to realize Canada stashes an awful lot of its debt among the provinces.
If you want to compare it to other countries, you really want to look at the total because there's a few other countries that have a structure like we do. We're fairly unique and we have a large amount of government responsibilities or at the provincial level.
In Canada, massive government programs like healthcare and education are paid for by the provinces. They often borrow money, go into debt to pay for these things. So looking just at Canada's federal debt isn't really counting everything. And that's different from the US, where there isn't nearly as much state debt to speak of, because most states actually have a constitutional obligation to balance their budgets. So if we do a little recalculation, looking this time at each country's total government debt to GDP ratio, and then let's update all of the numbers to reflect that properly, and then reorder the countries from top to bottom, we end up with this. All of a sudden, Canada's in the middle of the pack, a pack that some experts argue isn't doing so well to begin with.
The previous government in the United Kingdom just failed over a budget issue. The French government just failed in the last 2 weeks over a budget issue. The European Union is threatening to kick Italy out of the European Union over a budget issue. They're all in trouble, and most of their troubles are related to fiscal. Why would we gloat that we're doing better than them?
Except, again, we might not be. The problem with relying too heavily on stats like the debt to GDP ratio is that they give a really incomplete picture. And I'll explain what I mean. So if we have this straight, that Canada's GDP turns out to be roughly on par with its total debt, which maybe makes us average. But what isn't as obvious is that this country has been juicing its GDP, inflating it, not with its own inherent inbuilt productivity, but with a massive influx of immigrants. On average, over the past few decades, Canada's population has grown by somewhere between 200 and 600,000 people per year. That dropped off during the pandemic when borders were closed. But look what happened since then. Canada's population has grown by more than 1 million people over the past 2 years.
That type of population growth in kind of a rich country is unheard of. That's just off the charts.
We haven't had that sort of population growth in really more than a century.
We're adding way more consumers into the economy. Those people are all spending, so consumption is going to be higher. So if it really hadn't been for this strong immigration, we would, without a doubt, be in a recession right now.
Look at it this way. In 2023, sure, Canada had the third highest GDP growth in the G7. But a really easy way to tell that's because of all the extra people, if you look at the growth of GDP per capita, Canada is dead last, which might have been fine if this kind of population growth wasn't so unsustainable. The squeeze on housing, public services, the cost of living for all Canadians has been too much for provinces to bear. So Ottawa pulled up the drawbridge.
It's reducing permanent immigration levels by at least 20%.
Cutting temporary immigrant numbers by
basically hit pause on the system for 3 years.
So the government claim that GDP is at such a healthy level compared to debt. It's not the whole truth. And it hides the fact that in this country, debt is already piled on top of debt at many levels.
It's an enormous number. Then you pile on top of that all of the provincial debt Then you pile on top of that all the municipal debt. Then you pile on top of that all the household debt that's notorious in Canada. That we have one of the highest debt to income ratios in the G7. That's a lot of debt sort of washing around the economy, and it can and will eventually become a problem.
Increasing amounts of federal debt isn't really the debt itself, because debts can be repaid. And Canada's AAA credit rating ensures that it can continue to borrow for a long time to come. No, it's the interest on debt that hurts. Canada is expected to pay $54 billion just in interest on its federal debt this year. For comparison, that's more than all of the revenue the government is expecting from the GST, which, depending on how you want to look at it, almost makes the GST kind of like a debt interest tax, only because about the same amount of money that the government pulls in whenever you buy something, it has to pay right back out to service the debt.
All you're doing is paying for something you already consume. It's not helping anybody with affordable housing, access to healthcare, senior citizens pension benefit, employment insurance, none of that. It's not buying any of that. And you have to ask yourself, is there not a better way of using your $50 billion?
And to put a number that large into perspective, the federal government has committed around $34 billion to fund its $10 a day childcare program, $6 billion to help build housing, $8 billion for national defense, $1.5 billion to fund a new pharmacare program, all of that over several years. But added together, that's $50 billion. And when you do fold in the provinces, now you're looking at somewhere over $80 billion a year to service Canada's total government debt. No one we spoke to believes Canada is on the brink of any kind of debt crisis. Like I said, broadly speaking, Canada's good for it. But is this country's economy the crown jewel of the G7? No. And at some point, because the government has no immediate plan to balance the budget, the cost of debt may become too great a burden. The hard part is deciding exactly when that is.